Hello, I'm Oliver Colling, and this is my 70s TV childhood. Welcome back to my 70s TV childhood. We are the podcast you can eat between meals without ruining your appetite. The one whose honeycomb middle weighs so little, and the one which helps you work, rest and play. We are a podcast aimed at looking back to growing up as a child in 1970s Britain and remembering the place that TV had in our lives back then. I'm recording this episode in the middle of May and, well, let's face it, for us in the UK, this springtime hasn't really taken off yet. The winter we've just had has been wet, 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 as in lots of rain, wind, floods and generally miserable weather rather than the band with Marty Bello. It doesn't really feel like spring without a bit of warm weather, in my opinion. It's summed up by lots of men stripping off at the first sight of sunshine and ending up with bright red torsos as a result. I'm really missing the smell of burning flesh so far this year, but I'm sure it will return soon. When you're younger, and certainly for me in my childhood years, spring felt really special. It wasn't dark anymore when you had to get up in the morning to go to school, and the evenings got lighter and lighter, allowing more time for playing with your friends before being called in by your mum. Those primary school days were unique. We used to get occasional bits of homework, but nothing compared to secondary school. The need to revise for exams was still years ahead, and the excitement of the long days of summer and the seemingly endless summer holidays lay enticingly close. Certain things changed. We might be allowed to play on the school playing field at break time. The heating in the classrooms got turned off. Was our school the only one in the country where the heating was switched on in October and kept blasting away until the Easter holidays, no matter what the weather? You could be boiling hot in October sunshine and freezing cold in April snow, but that didn't matter. The heating went on and off at the same time every year. It was the same in school sports. We stopped playing football at Easter and then switched to more summery sports like running and bits and pieces of athletics, like running around the creosoted track on the school playing fields. I know I've mentioned this before in a previous episode, but how on earth did we all avoid serious illness or other side effects when playing on the school field which had been treated with deadly chemicals? I spoke about this in our episode about We Are the Champions in June 2023, and that episode got lots of feedback from listeners, and it fell into two distinct camps: those who loved the show and sport in general, and those who absolutely hated it and hated sport in general. So here's an early warning for you listeners. We are going to talk a bit about sport on TV again. But even if it's not your thing, I think you'll find some interesting memories in what we're looking at today. Incidentally, if you do have any comments or thoughts about this episode or on anything else we've mentioned over the 5 seasons of the podcast to date, you can do so by leaving a comment on our blog at www.my70stvchildhood.com, engaging with our Facebook, Twitter/X, LinkedIn or YouTube social media sites, or by simply emailing oliver@my70stvchildhood.com. We'd love to hear from you. So back to sport. In the same way that sport changed in our PE lessons at school, so it was in the sporting world. Regular listeners will know I'm a bit of a sports fanatic, and I was obsessed with football and cricket, particularly as a young boy. So the spring was great as the football season came to an end, and I was able to finalise the placing on my league letters from Shoot magazine. Do you remember those? They were brilliant, although they used to get a bit battered by the end of the football season. If you don't remember them, they were, well, a big piece of cardboard with slots in them for every place in all of the English and Scottish football leagues. Each team had a small tap in their team colours, which you placed in the appropriate slot depending on what position that team was in their particular league. Lots of fun every weekend, updating the league ladders to make sure that everything was accurate and, things like Berwick Rangers were correctly positioned in Scottish League Division 2 as it was then. Anyway, not for the first time, I digress. Sport changed with the seasons. As cricket began, and my attention turned from Manchester United to Lancashire County Cricket Club, the end of the football season followed a familiar pattern. The league would be won, usually by Liverpool it seemed in my childhood memory, with honourable mentions for Derby County, Leeds and Nottingham Forest. Sorry Arsenal fans, I don't remember the double of 1971, being that little bit too young. After that there'd be European finals, sometimes featuring British clubs, and then the home international championships when England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland all played each other over a 2-week period, which was brilliant. And then every other year there was a World Cup or a European Championship to look forward to. But in and amongst, there was another occasion which featured high the sporting calendar, the TV schedules and the national consciousness. In Australia they have the Melbourne Cup, which is known as the race which stops a nation. Well, in 1970s Britain, there was a football match which gripped the nation as we all gathered in front of our television sets to watch. And that was the FA Cup final. As I recall this episode, we're in the run-up to the 2024 FA Cup final, which is a repeat of last year's clash between Manchester City and Manchester United. As a United fan, I am a bit nervous, and my main hope is that we don't get humiliated by the all-powerful City, followed by a sneaking hope that we find a way to defeat the noisy neighbours, as Sir Alex called them. But it's not the same feeling of excitement I had about the cup final when I was younger, even if my team didn't feature in the match. And why was that? Well, the main reason that the cup final was such a big deal in the 70s was that it was one of the rare occasions when football fans got to watch a live football match on television. Looking back from today, where you can watch live football virtually 24 hours a day in Ultra HD from all over the world, it does seem remarkable that we didn't get to watch more than a handful of matches live on television every year. As well as that, there wasn't as much football going on, and the FA Cup was a big deal in itself. Winning it meant a huge amount and guaranteed entry into the European Cup Winners' Cup, if you remember that, and the chance to play against exotic foreign teams like Red Star Belgrade, Saint Etienne or Bayern Munich. So it really was a big deal, and both the BBC and ITV devoted hours of coverage of the match on the day of the final, often beginning to broadcast mid-morning and going on until way past the final whistle and celebrations. My earliest FA Cup memory was 1974. Liverpool were playing Newcastle and great things were expected from a talented Liverpool side, with lots of emerging talent like the young Kevin Keegan and Welshman John Toshak. They'd won the league the previous year and finished second that season, and they duly thrashed Newcastle 3-0. I was hooked. As a young child with a growing interest in football and a keen interest in watching TV, I'd found my ideal day in the calendar, and FA Cup final day became a much anticipated fixture. In 1975 we had an all-London affair between West Ham and second division Fulham, who managed to recruit England stars Bobby Moore and Alan Mullery to help them to the final. Their run also inspired a rather curious football record by Tony Rees and the Cottagers, based on a famous hit record of the time.
Down the Fulham road we're burning with ambition. The first division is where we want to be. And if you see what a team we've got this season, you know the reason we'll get there easily. But first we're heading down the Wembley way to show the world that we can really play. Oh, this year we're gonna win the cup. Hey, viva el Fulham. The next year you know we're going up. Hey, viva el Fulham. Alan M is a wonder, that's for sure. Hey, viva el Fulham. And Bobby, well, do we need say more? It's Fulham, por favor.
What a song, eh? Well, unfortunately, Fulham didn't quite live up to it, or win the FA Cup, as West Ham prevailed by 2-0, but they did provide a great story. And the following season, the story got even better when they signed the great George Best to come and play for them too. And this was also another feature of 1970s Cup final days, the Cup final record. I think the trend had been started by Chelsea in 1970 with their famous "Blue is the colour, football is the game" song, which got quite high up in the charts. So year after year, the finalists, as part of their traditional build-up ritual, went into a recording studio and sang what was usually a pretty dire ditty, which would then feature on that week's Top of the Pops before sliding back into obscurity. The very worst one was Manchester United's 1979 effort, Onward Sexton Soldiers, which is so dreadful that I can't find any surviving recordings to share with you. They all seem to have been deleted. Not surprising, really, because it was a drawl of a song to the tune of Onward Christian Soldiers and was, frankly, terrible. And the best? Well, it's hard to see beyond that 1970 Chelsea number, although I'm sure some listeners will have their own views on it. Please let us know. But back to the whole TV experience. I'll move swiftly past 1976 when plucky second division Southampton beat the mighty Manchester United by 1-0. I've watched that goal many times over the years, and I'm still pretty certain that Bobby Stokes was offside. Sour grapes, perhaps? You bet it is. I do remember bursting into tears at the end of that match, which wasn't really a very cool thing for a 9-year-old boy to do, but I was genuinely devastated. And I remember watching the Manchester United manager, Tommy Docherty, promise that he'd be back to go one better next year. So roll on to 1977, which provided my football highlight of the 1970s. After beating Leeds United 2-1 in the semi-final, I was counting down the days. In those days, there were lots of special magazines about the cup final, features in all the newspapers, and about a month between the semi-final and the final, so plenty of time to get excited. So what about the all-day TV coverage that we were talking about earlier? Was it as all-consuming as I remember? Well, let's see, shall we? I've got a copy of the Radio Times of 21st of May, 1977 here, cup final day. Let's take a look at how the day panned out, shall we? Quick reminder, the Radio Times only carried BBC programmes. For ITV, you had to buy the TV Times, which didn't include the BBC's programmes either. How daft was that? OK, what have we got? First off, we've got Chigley at 9 a.m. with an episode called The Broken Bridge.
Under bridges, over bridges to our destination. Hopping through the countryside, there's so much to be seen. Passengers waving as we steam through a station. Stoke up, Lyman, for the signal is at green. Time flies by when I'm the driver of a train, and I ride on the footplate there and back again.
Good stuff, even if by the age of 10 I wasn't really supposed to like that kind of thing anymore. Followed at 9:15 by These Are the Days. I've forgotten about that. It was a cartoon series set in the early 20th century about an American family getting by. It was a bit like a cartoon version of the Waltons, if you get the idea. And what do we have next? Oh, I don't believe it. Yet another showing of the adventures of Robinson Crusoe. Well, what a day is this turning out to be. We haven't even got to the football yet. Marvellous. At 10 a.m, we have Arlott and Truman on cricket. Now, that was a great show, taking a look at the history of cricket with two of the great characters of the time, Freddie Truman and John Arlott. I think I've actually got the book of the series somewhere. Then at 10:25, we got a Daffy Duck cartoon, followed at 10:30 by Zorro, which I always found a bit dull, to be honest. Outside of the masked man and the thrill of carving a Z or a Z, as the American show would have us say, it was a bit laboured. Oh, and then at 10:55... Yes, it's the old Saturday morning staple Laurel and Hardy in one of their most famous films, Another Fine Mess. This is shaping up to be a great cup final Saturday. And then it's 11:30, after a short weather forecast and a public information film, we're on to the main event. Time to sit down on the settee and remain there for the next 5 or 6 hours. Cup Final Grandstand was an institution. Frank Boff appeared to guide us through a whole day of Cup Final related entertainment. Well, let's see what we've got. At 11:30 we have half an hour of setting the scene with Barry Davis and Bob Wilson with the teams at their respective hotels. I seem to remember there's always a question about what they'd eaten for breakfast and then what they were having for lunch. I think the lunch was inevitably steak and chips. This was long before the high-carb, energy-rich pre-match routine of today's professionals. I'm sure several of the players had a quick smoke out of the game as well, but there were different times. After that, we had 15 minutes of highlights from the Women's FA Cup final between QPR and Southampton. That was the nation's annual focus on women's football. 15 minutes a few hours ahead of the, inverted commas, proper cup final. Wow. How far have we come since then? Then, after the women's, literally 15 minutes of fame, we moved on to interviews with Bob Paisley and Tommy Docherty, the two managers. Both were legends. Paisley had taken over from the legendary Bill Shankly and then proceeded to eclipse all that Shankly had done, whilst Docherty had taken Manchester United from the old second division to the higher reaches of the first division, playing exciting, devil-may-care football. What a great pair. Oh, and after these interviews came what for many of us, I think, was the highlight of Cup Final Day, apart from the football itself, of course. Final It's a Knockout was required viewing for many on Cup Final Day. Let's see what the Radio Times says about it. The excitement of It's a Knockout as teams from the supporters clubs of Liverpool and Manchester United compete in this traditional Cup Final contest. Joining in are past and present players and celebrity supporters, introduced by Eddie Waring and Stuart Hall, together with referee Arthur Ellis. And that was that. Basically, an episode of It's a Knockout featuring some people connected to each team coming from a neutral venue between the two teams' home bases. Might have even been held in Warrington, my hometown, which is right in the middle of Manchester and Liverpool, but I may be taking my wishful thinking a bit far with that. Stuart Hall, in spite of his later fall from grace, was always brilliant fun, being a very knowledgeable football commentator himself. I was always ably supported by Eddie Waring. Yeah, thank you, Stuart. I think but not do any more impressions, and Arthur Ellis, who had himself been a linesman in the World Cup final, no less, in 1950. That went on for 45 wonderful minutes, and then we had an interlude with, highlights of the World Heavyweight Championship bout between Muhammad Ali and Alfredo Evangelista. I honestly don't remember that one. But don't worry, we were back at Wembley 15 minutes later, and there we stayed for the rest of the afternoon with Meet the Teams, the road to Wembley, profiles of the key players, and the results of the Match of the Day Goal of the Season competition, where one lucky viewer was going to win, wait for it, £200 in premium bonds. Ooh. 2:40, we've got Abide With Me, sung by the crowd, accompanied by the massed bands of the Royal Marines and their Director of Music, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Neville, MVO, FRAM, RM. And then onto the main event, including halftime music from the massed bands of the Royal Marines with their Director of Music, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Neville, MVO, FRAM, RM. So what happened in the match? Well, Liverpool were trying for an unprecedented treble of League, FA Cup and European Cup, so came into the match as massive favourites. But on the day, my team won through, providing me with one of my most cherished sporting memories.
And now to Koppel. Hughes with the lead, but he's beaten in the air. Greenough trying to get in behind Tommy Smith and might succeed in doing so. And the ball to the net. And it's got to be down to Jimmy Greenough, although Macari and Hill are there to claim it too.
Manchester United won 2-1. And Liverpool went on to beat Borussia Mönchengladbach in the European Cup final a few days later. But I was still basking in United's marvellous victory. But after all that excitement, what did the BBC have on to follow 6 hours of blanket FA Cup coverage? Wow, the FA Cup final, Stuart Hall and Rolf Harris. What an afternoon that was. But seriously, there was something really special about that day for all football supporters and for the wider population. The combination of a rare live football match with the excitement and prestige of the FA Cup, as it was, made a heady combination, meaning the nation was gripped, not just by the BBC's coverage, but also by ITV's similar blanket coverage centred around the great Brian Moore's commentary. It was a one-off day in the year, loved by young and old, and I'm not sure we've had anything like it since. 12 months later, I remember having a few friends round to our house to watch Ipswich take on Arsenal, and we alternated watching the blanket coverage on television with playing football in the garden, reenacting famous cup final goals. Really happy memory. The last year of the 70s brought more heartbreak to me, but I will mention it, as one of our most loyal listeners, Alan, is also an Arsenal fan. In the 1979 final, Arsenal were by far the better team and led for 2-0 for most of the match, leaving me in a pretty dark, depressing place. But a few minutes before the end of the match, Manchester United managed to score 2 goals out of nowhere, and it looked like extra time was beckoning. Until the moment which settled what some people call the most exciting end to a cup final, possibly ever.
There's a minute left on the clock. Brady for Arsenal. Right across. Sunderland! It's there! It's 3-2. Arsenal are back in front through Alan Sunderland. United have possibly thrown it away within seconds of getting it back.
Well, I do hope you enjoyed that moment, Alan. The 80s saw the decline of the Cup Final all-day TV fest. Partly because of the general decline in the standing of football, I think, and partly because we as an audience were becoming a bit more sophisticated. And then the awful events at Hillsborough in 1989 brought an end to Cup Final jollities for a few years, after which time Sky TV had arrived and the face of TV football in the UK had changed forever. Why did we need to dedicate so much coverage to what had become just another live football match, although one with a bit more history to it, granted? For a brief moment in time, Cup Final Day was a national event, a bit like the Super Bowl in the US, but alas, no more. In spite of that, I do look back with extremely happy memories, particularly of seeing football supporters dressed as penguins carrying buckets of water on rapidly revolving turntables just for the pride of their teams. In Cup Final, it's a knockout. Here's a late postscript to this week's episode. Since we recorded this episode, the 2024 Cup Final has been played, and I'm delighted to say that much against the odds, my team won. As Brian Moore might have said, that's the magic of the FA Cup for you. What memories do you have of watching Cup Final Day in the 70s? Let me know by sharing them on our blog at www.my70stvchildhood.com. Visit one of our many social media sites, or email oliver@my70stvchildhood.com. Hope you've enjoyed our trip back to 70s football memories, and hope you can join us next week for our next quiz, or in a fortnight for the next regular edition of the podcast. Until then, don't forget to like, rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts, and to join us again soon for more from My 70s TV Childhood.